There comes a time in every person's life when you realise it's not about doing what you are told, but doing what you know is right for you. Let us take a journey of learning and discovery with the world's most successful people who are living the life of their dreams, walking through life using their inner wisdom and being of service to others. Forget exams, grades and test scores. What is your purpose? As we let go of what we think should be and learn from our elders to gain knowledge, inspiration and a true sense of who we are. What are your dreams? Does your life have meaning? Are you living a life of significance? Let's talk with today's guest. Hello, this is Mark Taylor and welcome as we spend some more time together on the Learning on Fire podcast. Today I'm talking to Angela McIver. Hi Angela, thanks for joining me and let's explore the journey of who you are.
Hello.
Can you start? Let's give us a little bit of background in terms of where you live and your sort of family setup there and how your sort of education background and your passions lie.
Sure. I live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the States, and I live with my husband and 3 children. I have 2 children in high school and 1 in middle school at the moment. I have lived in Philadelphia for nearly 30 years, but I grew up out west in the western part of the United States. So my experiences growing up are very different from what my children are experiencing growing up here in Philadelphia.
And what sort of differences are those?
Oh, they are tremendous. So I grew up in a state, New Mexico, which is the entire state of New Mexico at the time had a population of 1 million people in the entire state. And the Philadelphia area where we grew up is almost 3 to 5 million people if you consider the suburban area. So my children are growing up in a very urban, metropolitan environment. I grew up in a very suburban, southwestern environment. They just have, I think, a lot more access as kids to their surroundings because everything is walkable and they're able to get on public transportation, and that's not how it is out west. Everything is very far away and not as densely populated. So those experiences are different. Our schooling experiences were very different too. I went to a very large suburban high school, that was on many, many acres, a big campus, and my children attend urban high schools, which were hard for me to get used to when I moved east. It's very difficult to see schooling on the East Coast of the United States as opposed to how it looks the further west you go. It's a very interesting contrast, how I grew up learning and how my children are growing up.
It makes a lot of sense, and as someone who lives in the UK, where you could almost fit our island into some of the states individually over there, and I mean I've travelled to the US quite a few times now, but it still just amazes me the difference between state to state, let alone just the vast distances between various cities and that kind of thing. I mean, it literally is a whole world apart.
Well, it's funny because when I went to college on the East Coast, and I remember calling home to my parents because I went home with a friend for Thanksgiving, and they lived in New York. And I could not believe that we could get through so many states in like a matter of hours. Whereas when you live out west, you drive 5 hours anyway, and you're still trying to get out of your own state. It's very different, the states.
You've mentioned already about how your life is very different to your children's life, but what was the difference in terms of how it feels for you from your actual sort of growing up experience as well as just the learning idea compared to what it's like there now?
As a parent, I was a child of the 80s, and I have found that parenting in this millennium is very different than how I was parented as a child and as a teenager. And the intensity of academics has increased so much, at least here in the States. The pressure for students at young ages to know what they want to do and to develop resumes and get experience, it's mind-boggling to me, and I think it is really problematic for many reasons. So I think that if I look at the biggest contrast between my experiences learning growing up and my children's experiences, that has to be the most glaring. And something that it's difficult to negotiate as a parent. As you know, we just talked about my daughter right before this call. Just the stress of high school for children, I think, is really intense these days.
I think it really is. And the one thing I've noticed, what you were saying, our children are about the same kind of age. And a lot of it is they have all these things they're having to deal with all the time. And also it's the kind of the mixed messages I find are often sometimes key as well, because lots of schools are saying, oh, you need to do this, you need to do that, but actually it might not be important. It's only really that the government are saying that you have to do it. But then at the same time, they're still having to do endless papers, and they still end up having to do endless tests. And so there's a kind of a mixed message, and I think it's really hard for them to get a real sense of themselves. And like you said, just find out who they are and what they want to do. And hopefully that's what this podcast is helping people with, is to sort of hear people who've come from their wisdom and their understanding and experience, to be able to share that this is how I've been able to do it, and actually this is what's kind of worked for me. And I think hearing all those things is hopefully going to give them a little bit of support and guidance into how to navigate all of that.
Absolutely.
So what was valuable about your school experience?
I look back on my school experiences, as a parent now, like I said, contrasting my own children's school experiences. And I think that the thing that was wonderful about my school experiences was the lack of high pressure. We didn't have that, and it allowed me as a student to explore many different avenues. And I talk with lots of parents these days about, when was it that we started thinking about college, and when was that, important? And it really wasn't until, for us, our, junior year of high school. But for my children, it starts in middle school, right? When they're in 6th and 7th grade, they're starting to think, they're hearing and getting all these messages around going to college and what they need to be doing. And our children attend a school that is a magnet high school. So you have to have certain grades and test scores to get in. So it started for them in middle school, where they were very aware that they had to have good attendance, and they had to have high grades, and they had to do well on the test. That was not something that I experienced. And I think that was a real benefit. You were able to be a child longer than now.
I've just been spending some time with some of my family. They live about 3 hours away from where I live, and I've had my 2 nieces in the house today, and they're both 3 years old, and it's just wonderful. You sort of forget about how they just flip from one thing to the other. They're playing with a bit of this, they're doing a bit of that, they ask this question, they ask that question, and it's all just learning and experience and trying things out and giving it a go and then doing something else. And I think it's really important for everyone to remember that's innately who we are when we're born and when we're growing up. And like you said, these pressures are just something which get put on top of us. And I think a lot of the stress comes from us just innately understanding it's not really how we work. It's not really who we are. We're actually here to thrive and to experience things and to grow and to follow our passions and just to sort of see how all that goes. And I think even if we just understand that, even if we are feeling that we're up against it with whatever happens to be going on in school, just gives you a little chink in the armor, really, just to be able to go, oh yeah, but I can just remember what it was like to have that freedom and know that you can find ways of being able to do that. Then it just gives you a little bit of a way out, I think.
That's true. And one of the things that I do is I study how children learn math. I was very interested in and why so many children, at least in the States, leave elementary school or primary school still struggling in math. And I started studying how children learn math. And what I did was just sit down and interview them and have them talk to me about what they were thinking, what was going through their head. And I would tell students, it doesn't matter if you get this answer right or wrong. I just want to know how you're thinking. But having kids open up and talk about how they think fundamentally changed the way I thought about how we teach and how students learn. And I started really figuring out, okay, we know what it is that children need to learn, but how do we create an environment where they feel that passion for learning and feel engaged around learning? And that really, something changed in me when I started sitting down and started asking students, just tell me what you're thinking. Tell me what's going on. Tell me how you would solve this problem. Tell me why it's a problem and how it's so hard. And we realized that the structures that we have in place now for teaching students don't allow them to build confidence and feel passion and be engaged in the learning that happens for them. And that's really unfortunate. And at least in the States, a big piece of education has been focused on standardized testing and testing at every grade. And so learning and the curriculum has changed to respond to that in a really unfortunate, negative way.
I think that's really true, and this is probably a great time for you just to talk a little bit about your dinner table math and exactly how this way of education fits into your life and how you've enabled your life to work around yourself as a business owner.
Oh, sure. So, I got very interested in this. I was a former middle school math teacher, but I left teaching math to run a program. In the United States, the Department of Education funds programs for low-income first-generation students. So these are students who would be the first in their families to go to college and come from low-income families. And we were housed on university campuses, and I ran this program to expose high school students to post-secondary education, to what it would be like to go to university. And they lived on the campuses during the summer. We were a math science program, so our charge was not only to get students to go to college, but we wanted to get them to go to college to major in math and science fields. And we were very successful getting kids into college. However, our children started dropping out of their math and science majors in their first year, and I couldn't figure out why. So I started sitting in on the classes because we were housed on a university campus. I went to the professors and said, can I just sit in on the classes and find out what's going on? And I discovered that students are dropping out of the classes not because of what they failed to learn in high school, but because of what they failed to learn in elementary school, that they just didn't have this foundation for being able to, really actively participate in higher level math classes. It was very shaky. And I started looking for assessments and professional development we could use with our teachers to address this. And I couldn't find anything and decided to go back to school to study older children with weak math foundations. So that's what I did. And that was my dissertation looked at older students and was based on interviews of students solving problems and just talking me through how they were thinking. And it fundamentally changed the way I thought about teaching. And I started my first business actually was working with middle and high school teachers around remediation. Like, this is really what the problem is. This is really why students are struggling. And this is how you can, fill that gap, close that gap. And I was very content working in that area, but then my own children started elementary school. And I initially thought that our children were struggling in math because they failed to learn the math that was taught in our elementary schools. But I began to realize that the math that was being taught in elementary schools, at least here in the States, I felt was not aligned well with what was needed for middle and high school success. And, our children were attending a highly rated school and looked really great on paper. But when I was digging down in the curriculum, I realized that there were so many areas that our kids were missing. And so I started an after-school program for my daughter and her friends, and it grew. And so so that kind of shifted my entrepreneurial pursuits, and I started focusing on elementary school students and working with them. And it really was just a kind of side thing. We ran it out of our house initially, but it got so big and we had a waiting list that in 2014 I found a commercial space and opened up. It's called Trapezium Math Club, and it's a club where kids come after school and they do math. But we teach kids in a very different way. If you came into our space, there are no tables and chairs in our space. We sit on the floor. Everyone takes off their shoes. We sit on the floor. There are whiteboard walls. So kids have their own, can move where they need to move, how they need to move. If they need to get up and, walk around while they're trying to figure out a problem, they can. We give kids that freedom. We didn't want it to feel like a classroom. And that was one of the things that is, really my focus is what is the environment that maximizes learning for children and makes them love to come to school, makes them love to do the math. And we found that we could give students much harder math when we optimized the environment that they were in and when we gave them permission to fail. Made them really comfortable with struggle and developing tenacity. And so we've been doing that for many years. And what I started doing was developing these activities and curriculum for schools and teachers. But when parents came to pick their kids up from our program, they, I would tell them what they could work with their child on home to build their skills. And I would say, we have these materials that we sell to schools, and the parents started buying the school materials. And we realized that we could develop materials specifically for parents to work with their children at home on math in a way that isn't like the typical workbook math. Most people think that when they're working on math, they just need to get a workbook and make their child do all these drills. And our math really is intended to engage both the parent and the child and doesn't require paper and pencils generally, and are fun activities that develop reasoning and fluency for young children in math. So that's the long story and how we got to where I am today.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense, and I think it's a little bit like I said before. I guess it's that kind of when you see kids growing up, they have that innate skill of what they're doing. You never see a toddler trying to stand up and walk once. They do it hour after hour after hour, and it's just part of what they do. And I think reconnecting with that, just that kind of every time you don't get something right, you've worked out how not to do it, so therefore you're slightly closer to understanding it and
Absolutely.
doing it again and going round and round that cycle. And when you can embrace that, the whole world just feels like a completely different place, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I didn't learn that until I was an adult, maybe when I was in college or graduate school. I learned, I didn't take it personally. I didn't think that it was, it was me, and that I for the longest time I thought, I just must not be smart, or I'm not as smart as this person. And that's not it. It's that whole growth mindset that children need. But that's really hard to teach kids. It's really hard. We've really focused on that and find that it is really difficult. And I think part of it is these mixed messages they get around schooling and the importance of schooling. A friend of mine's daughter just was applying for colleges, and one of the schools, she said, was upset about a grade that she got in an early quarter in the year. So she ended the year with like a A or a B in her physics class, but earlier than the first term she had a C, and the school was really worried about that. And I thought, that is horrible, because the message that you're sending is that you can't fail, you can't do poorly ever. And I think we send kids mixed messages when we have that. They don't want to try at something that they think they may fail at, because we are reinforcing that message, whether we know it or not.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and it sounds like all the people that you're involved in teaching are are very lucky to sort of to be actually experiencing that on a regular basis, and I guess that brings us on nicely into which teachers when you were in school, who do you remember, and what was it about them that really sticks out for you?
The teachers that stuck out for me were the teachers who clearly loved what they were doing. They either loved teaching or they loved their subject. And that really made a difference. I have many teachers like that. I wish I could say that I had more teachers than not, but that's actually not true. I had more teachers who I felt that you certainly didn't see the passion, but it only takes one or two that are really great. So I had some great high school teachers who in several of my subjects who really loved the subject and got me to love the subject and want to learn more. And when I was in college, I had a great economics professor who I was not an economics major initially. And then I took an economics course and realized how much I loved it because it was so mathematical. It made so much sense. But I think the underlying common denominator for the teachers that impacted me in my life were those who had a true passion for what they were doing or for who they were teaching.
And I think that's true for all of us, isn't it? Everyone listening, in terms of if you spend your time doing what you're really passionate about, then that just comes across in a way which is almost unteachable because it's just your true personality shining through. And I think that really is an important thing for us all to remember. Who did you admire when you were young, and what was it about that person that had such an impact?
There were a number of people that I admired when I was young. And it's funny because it's in retrospect when I look back and I think about how my father probably is one of the people I admired the most when I was a child, and I think because he was also so enthusiastic about his children, and I think my father, when my parents had 5 children, my father was a physician. And he wasn't home a lot, but when he was home, he always came up with these projects for me to do. And when I look back on it, I realized that I was probably the only one of the children who was very excited about these. He could get me to do almost anything. So I remember one summer he was like, we have all these. This is back in the day of card catalogs, right?
Yeah.
So this is before the internet, before you could search things up online. And we had a fairly large library of books. And my father said to me, it would be really great if we could get a card catalog. We could organize these books, and you could create a card catalog, and you could do it by subject, by author, by title, and I'll get you all the stuff you need. And I was like, yes, I'm in. That was my summer project, and I think, how did he get me to do that? He was able to get me to do a lot of things like that, just for his enthusiasm for it. So I have to say, my dad, he was also he's still alive, and he's just wonderful. But he was just a very different father for that generation. I realize, and it had an impact. It's had an impact on how I live my life and how I kind of feel like I have power and agency. And I think that was unusual for that generation to do that. So for instance, when we were growing up, we would get an allowance, but my father would pass this book around the table at the end of the week on Sundays. He'd be like, okay, so how much should you get? And he never, like the cap would be maybe $10. I don't remember what it was. And then he would just give us this book, and we had to write down what we thought we actually earned. And when I thought back on it, I was like, we never asked for the whole $10 because we would say, I didn't make my bed on Tuesday, and then I didn't really do my part of the kitchen when I had to clean it. We would do that, and so we would take money off, and he never questioned. He would just look at what we wrote, and then he'd be like, okay, and he would give it to us. And I think that, now looking back on it, I was like, that was so progressive at that time, I guess, but it was so wonderful because he really believed in us, believed in me, and that was really big.
Really sounds amazing, and I really like that because you really have to think about everything, don't you, in terms of putting a value on it. And like I said, it's whether you did an amount of time on something or the number of things you were going to do. And I think that's fantastic. It's a really interesting way of doing it, especially having gone through the whole kind of pocket money and allowance thing with our children in terms
Right.
of having, there's a certain amount you do get, there's a certain amount you could have if you do more chores, or would you like to do more of this? This would really help us out around the house. And it's interesting seeing their reaction to all those things and whether they think it's a positive or a negative, or whether we're just literally asking them to do things they shouldn't be entitled to do. I don't know. It's always a little bit.
Right.
But I've never. I think that particular way of just sort of you can do whatever you like. This is what we think. This is what you should do. What you could do, and what value to put on that. I think it's a really, like I say, progressive is probably the right kind of phrase for it. It's brilliant.
Right. Yeah. I think, I this didn't come back to me really until I was a parent myself and I started thinking about the things that my father did. And it was, I am so thankful for that. It had an impact on me in so many ways.
And what was the best piece of advice you've ever been given, and who gave it to you?
So when I was in college, I was given the advice or the saying that has kind of lived with me: excuses are tools of the incompetent. And it was at a point when I made an excuse for not doing something. And that really truly has stuck with me from that point on. Like, excuses are tools of the incompetent, and don't come with excuses. Own what you do, own what you didn't do. And I have to think that that probably is the best piece of advice I got, or best saying that has served as kind of a guiding principle for me.
Yeah, no, I really like that. I've heard that in a couple of guises, and it really does hit home, doesn't it? That I think sort of owning either side of it. If you really want to do it and it's important, you will. If you don't want to do it, you'll find a reason not to. But either way, it's still your decision, and
Right.
it really is an important thing to remember, I think.
Absolutely.
And what advice would you give your younger self now?
I was afraid to fail as a child. I did really well in school, and then I got to a point where things were hard, and it was hard because I was supposed to work on it. I wasn't used to having to work. And I think that's a challenge that parents have with kids who get things quickly, right? And you're worried that once they hit something that requires hard work, they're not going to know how to deal with it. And I didn't know how to deal with it as a child, and I quit things that I shouldn't have because I just thought I wasn't good at it. And it really was because I didn't realize that you have to work at it. I was fortunate to not struggle when I was in an elementary and middle school, and I was in a gifted program, whatever that means, pull out to get extra enrichment, that kind of stuff. But there was a point where I couldn't just sit in class and absorb the material and learn it, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to study. I didn't learn that until, I got to college. I kind of figured it out. But high school, I didn't take the hardest classes I could have because I just thought I wasn't smart. I thought I had reached my potential, right? And
Mm.
I would tell my younger self, that's crazy. You need to work. You need to sit down and get some work done, right?
It really is, and it does amaze me. I've had this conversation with my wife a few times. That kind of, I find it almost unbelievable that when you're being educated in school, you're often not educated in how to learn.
Right.
And like you say, so there are some people who just get stuff for a long time, which is great on the surface of it, but then like you say, at some point you have to actually learn, because either you reach the capacity of what you can just absorb because it gets too difficult and then you have to work it out that way, or you might be someone who struggles from an early age just because you learn in a different way and the system doesn't quite fit for you. But until you realize that you actually have to work out what works for you, and that's the other thing, it's different for lots of different people, but once you get that as a concept and an idea, then you can work at it in whichever way you can. And it's, I have to say, it's where some of the sports things that our kids have done, I found to be really positive. Katie, our youngest, is into gymnastics, and recently she's been doing tumbling. And there's been some real great skills in there in terms of she wasn't able to do a flick when she first started, and she didn't do it the second week or the third week because you have to build that core strength and you need all the skills that they put into it. But just by doing the same things week in, week out, regularly, not seeing massive differences until that one day that all the things just fall into place, and then you can do it. And then you can do two, and then before you know it, you're doing things you could never imagine before. But there's a little bit of faith, a little bit of understanding that the people that are coaching you, the people that are guiding you, are able to support you in what you're trying to achieve. And you might not see that immediate result, but learning that it's over a course of time, over a program of doing something, you will get there if you just persevere at it.
That's so true. And I really try to, well, I do a lot of work with teachers, professional development with teachers, and I've tried in the past to use this coaching metaphor. And, I ask people if they've ever done sports as a child or whatever. And this idea of yourself as a coach, like if you think of yourself as a coach and not necessarily as a teacher, I think teachers think their job is to provide information. They're like, they are the purveyors of this information, and the children take it in, right? But coaches don't think like that. Coaches say, okay, I have this team and I need to figure out where their strengths and their weaknesses are, and I need to give them, a program that builds on their individual strengths, right? Because I want the entire team to succeed. And I, developed this program a few years ago for teachers that was based on this coaching model. And it was so surprising to me how few teachers adopted that. It's a paradigm shift as a teacher. If you think of yourself as a coach, then you teach in a very different way. And I think that would be key in moving the needle in terms of education, is that if we can get more teachers to think of themselves as coaches, it changes what you do. And you're right. Sports and athletics really help drive that home. And you can use that with your children, when they are struggling in school. You can say, yeah, but remember when you couldn't tumble and you had to just keep practicing.
For sure. I mean, that's definitely true. And the thing that's just struck me there, because my teaching experience, because I'm a musician and a drummer, and I teach drums both as a whole class. It's sort of rhythm workshops, which is obviously very different because you're trying to get everybody involved and you come up with ways to support everyone and for them to support themselves. But when I'm teaching drums individually or percussion individually, like you said, because it's one-on-one, just because you've taught a certain way for one child, it doesn't necessarily work for the next one. So all the time you're having to reassess what you're doing, which I guess if you're a teacher in a classroom all the time, you don't have so much of that one-to-one time where you're having to make sure that this person understands in the same way. So I guess in some ways I'm quite privileged to sort of have that sort of been able to see both sides of the coin and just having to work out, so you don't understand it this way, but we can try it this way, and you can try it this way. And with experience, obviously, you get to do a myriad of ways of doing it, but there are still times you get stumped because everybody's different and you come across someone who's a mixture of all of those things, and you have to work out a new way at that point as well.
Right. That's absolutely it.
So what does your future look like?
Wow, I wish I knew. I am, I left teaching and education to build a business, and I absolutely love it. And it takes me in all these different directions. I really want to empower parents to feel confident in working with their children, in math. And that's different than teaching classes of kids. It's really teaching parents how they can be a support for their own children. And I don't know if you have the same phenomena in the United States. There's this phenomenon of people saying, I was just never good at math, or I'm not a math person, and this belief that math is something that you are either good at or you're not, like you're born with it or you're not. And so it's really hard to get parents to feel comfortable and confident working with their children if they've had negative experiences themselves in school in math. And so I think my future really is that, my past or my present is working and teaching teachers and teaching children. And I feel like my future is teaching parents.
And that, I guess, is really key from both your professional experience and also, like say, as a parent yourself. When these things start to align and sort of cross over, then yeah, I think that's quite exciting, isn't it? Because you can really sort of see your whole life sort of in enveloping exactly who you are and what you do with all of those skills together.
Right, absolutely.
What resource has had the biggest impact on your life, and why was that? And I guess this could be a podcast, a book, a video, a film, a song, or anything which has just really touched you and made a real impact for you.
Oh my goodness. I mean, there's so many books, and so I always tend, when people ask me that, I always tend to be the last book that I read or the last book that because there were so many. Um, you know, I love podcasts. I listen to many of them, and the one podcast that I find so interesting and so helpful for me in terms of just it, I always kind of come away from that podcast with a different sense of like my purpose and where I need to go and how I need to focus is the podcast How I Built This with Guy Raz, who looks at entrepreneurs, and that's because that's my space. That's what I'm doing, and I'm an entrepreneur. And he talks to entrepreneurs and just talks to them about what their process was or how they moved forward. And I love that podcast. I also love this other history podcast called Uncivil, which really looks at the Civil War in the United States from a different lens, and it's really amazing and great. So those influence me quite a bit.
I really like that, and obviously, as a podcaster myself, I love it when people have podcasts at the top of the things which really influence them. And I think as podcasts get more and more accessible, people understand them because you can just dive into things which you're interested in, specific for you and what you're into. It's a fantastic medium, and it's really exciting to be part of that world. And if you want to know any of the resources that we've talked about here, if you go to educationonfire.com and in the search bar put in Angela McIver, then we'll have details of all the show notes and everything on this podcast, so people will be able to click through and get links to all these things as well. So thank you, Angela. I mean, for people who are really interested in what you're doing and what you've been talking about, especially if they're as parents or certainly people involved in math, what's the best way for them to find out more information about you, and where can they find out those details?
So we can, our website is dinnertablemath.com, www.dinnertablemath.com, but they can reach us on any of our social media platforms. My Twitter is just my name, Angela McIver, but we have Dinner Table Math on Facebook as well, and Instagram.
That's lovely, and thank you, Angela, for sharing your wisdom and allowing us to learn from your great experiences.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Learning on Fire podcast. For more information, please visit educationonfire.com and follow the links from the homepage. This show is sponsored by the National Association for Primary Education. Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire.